false narratives has succeeded in convincing our young Premier to gut the Biodiversity Act. It is not the first time that Forest Nova Scotia, an avowed forest industry advocacy group that receives large sums of money from the government to administer programs, not very different from the We Charity story, has been involved in such underhanded campaigns. In fact, our being here today supporting Jacob and our demand to protect the moose and to impose a moratorium on clear cutting has a lot to do with Forest Nova Scotia when it existed under the name of FPANS, the Forest Products Association of Nova Scotia. On November 6, 2010, 11 years ago, I stood outside this legislature when NDP DNR Minister MacDonnell, a farmer and teacher by background, said, "We don't really have an industrial forest, a small private forest, and crown forest. We have one forest, and it's one forest for all of us." And he promised a 50% reduction on clear cutting on crown and private lands. Yes, on those now totally taboo private lands. So look how far downward we've gone in that period of time. That commitment reflected the recommendations of the Natural Resources Strategy, which involved inputs from over 2,000 citizens from all walks through a voluntary planning process in 2008 and 2009, and in two technical reports, one by wildlife biologist Bob Bancroft and forest ecologist Donna Crossland, and one by Jan Porter, who I understand is on his last day up here today, who at the time was Woodlands manager with Abitibi Bowater, whose assets were later sold to the Crown. The precise recommendations were selected from these competing perspectives by a panel of elders. Justice Constance Gluby, Alan Shaw, a prominent businessman, and Joel Marshall, the executive director of the Union of Nova Scotia Indians. But when the first hints of what was to come came out earlier in 2010, FPANS, Forest Nova Scotia, got to work and paid a purported six-figure number, figure that one out, of dollars to Robert G. Wagner, a prominent professor of forestry at the University of Maine, to review the technical reports. His report still remains hidden from public view to this day, but it was forwarded secretly to government and the Premier in particular. He concluded the recommendations on clear cutting, herbicides, and whole tree harvesting by Bancroft and Crossland were not consistent with the best available forest research or with the principles of sound forest management. And therefore he believed that the underlying rationale by the steering panel for the regulatory restrictions of these practices was based on weak scientific and/or technical justification. At the same time, he praised the report by John Porter. I was given a leaked copy of that review at the time and was shocked by how biased it was, and forwarded lengthy comments to the government which still remain public. Needless to say, the train had left the station. In early 2011, MacDonnell was shifted to agriculture and replaced by the much more industry-friendly Charlie Parker. From then on, it was downhill for the reduction in clear-cutting promises, as we know, and the failure, we might remind Mr. Rankin, to implement the Natural Resources recommendations was a big factor in the Dexter government losing the election in October of 2013. But before that happened, the Bowater Mill closed in June of 2013, and the Buy Back the Mercy campaign was initiated by people at Rankin's Corner of the Woods, the very people who are now advocating for the Ingram River Wilderness area. And they convinced, it spread over Nova Scotia, and they convinced the government to buy the lands owned by Resolute Forest Products so they would not fall into the wrong hands. And so it would be used for conservation, community forests and recreation, and yes, for some of the old school forestry. 220,000 hectares were purchased in December of 2012 by the people of Nova Scotia. And that made a total of 566,000 hectares of Crown land in the west, what they call the Western Crown lands, which was described, and still is, the last great wood basket in Nova Scotia. The new Liberal government, however, didn't waste time continuing where Dexter and Company left off, making a secret deal with Northern Pulp in January of 2014 to increase its wood supply to 225,000 tons annually from 100,000, and it was widely suspected that this would come from Western Nova Scotia. In April of 2014, the new Liberal government hired the very Jan Porter of the Porter Report, the man on his last day up here. It was then out of regular work with the closure of the Bowater Mill. They hired him as executive director of DNR's Renewable Resources branch. That was followed by DNR setting up a consortium of mills in the fall of 2014, which became Westfor in 2016 to harvest the Western Crown lands. And then the free-for-all began, harvesting this last great wood basket in the most biodiversity rich and carbon storage rich area of Nova Scotia. Also, actually, the most nutrient poor and the most sensitive to harvest. Of course, the plunder did not go unnoticed, and with the public uproar, the Liberals announced an independent review of forestry as a major plank in their successful re-election strategy in 2017. Rankin didn't forget that lesson when he made his election plank. They got back in, and we got the Leahy review, and with things on hold while it was in process. But then after it was released, the plunder again began, this time with Ian Rankin as Minister of Forestry. Again, that generated more public uproar, and we are where we are here today. So the trajectory since the Leahy report is a very familiar one. It's the same trajectory that followed the natural resources strategy, and Forest Nova Scotia had a big role in it then and now, and is giving us the same result. No change or minor change with a lot of window dressing. It's good news to hear that John Porter is finally retiring from L&M today, I guess, but watch where he goes. The last company man to leave was Alan Eddy. Alan Eddy went to Port Hawkesbury Paper. So now with that little bit of history, I would like to talk to the Premier. So Mr. Premier, let me talk to you directly. In brief, Mr. Rankin, my message is you need us and we need you. You need us if you want to accomplish those laudable environmental goals you say you're committed to. You need us because in the next election, your industrial forestry supporters won't be voting Liberal. They'll be voting for the party nipping at your heels as it has catered unequivocally through thick and thin, even with the Northern Pulp closure. So that leaves us, Mr. Premier. And you know that. In the run-up to the election of a new leader, you and your campaign called pretty well every environmentally oriented person I know, including myself about 5 times, and a lot of them joined the Liberal Party to vote for you if they weren't already members. I don't know whether that carried the day, but in a general election, there's no doubt environment will matter big time, and you need now to gain credibility, not to make promises. That credibility will be based on what you're able to do in your remaining months in office. And Mr. Premier, we need you. You remain, right at the moment, right now, our biggest hope for seeing real change in the way our government, of whatever party, makes the right decisions related to the dual and related threats of climate change and biodiversity loss. It's the simplest route if you do it. And if you make the tough decisions, we will support you. But there is a credibility problem, a big one, with your quick backtracking on the Biodiversity Act in response to Forest Nova Scotia's campaign, and your refusal to date to implement a moratorium while we will wait for the Leahy report to be implemented. There are 2 problems, however, there are 2 problems with the Leahy report, especially if you do it in a hurry. And I'm sorry I'm being long-winded, and I'll try to be through quickly. First, we still only have a very vague idea of how it will be implemented. And the big question is, how will the high production forestry component look like? What will it look like? The discussion paper propositions from February 2020 were clearly excessive. But we have not seen anything since. We have not seen the wood supply model and the assumptions it is based on. And in particular, we need to know whether there will be a substantial reduction in wood supply from Crown lands as Leahy and company expected, but you said in December 2018 was not necessary. You said that. If we don't see such a reduction, Mr. Premier, the results ecologically will be worse than what we have. Clear cutting will be sanctioned on the best Crown lands remaining, and the rest will be pocketed with holes and crisscrossed by roads as the system is pushed to produce the wood demanded by the mills, all at public and nature's expense. We also, Mr. Premier, have heard nothing of the old forest policy, and we heard nothing about the mysterious environmental assessment process that will dictate how public input is to occur. I tried to get FOI FIPOP on that. It was going to cost me $850 to get that information.
Shame!
For the Leahy process to work, to gather widespread support and to achieve what it is intended to do, you can't push it out of the door on an election timeline. In the meantime, we are soon to be 3 years since Leahy and our 12th year since the Natural Resources Strategy. That's why we need a moratorium. And the destruction is actually accelerated in the past year of COVID because of the change in the market and high lumber prices. That makes big volume, old forests of southwest Nova Scotia a prime target. The same forest that stores so much carbon and it is so valuable biodiversity-wise. I'm almost through. So that's why we're a little nervous. But it has been clear from the very beginning that there should have been a moratorium on clear cutting, or because of semantics, we have to say moratorium on even age management. In fact, LNF, when you were minister, secretly floated significant reductions in September of 2018, within a month after the Leahy report was handed in, but then quickly retracted them, all behind closed doors, were it not for CBC opening up a few of them. And McNeil, when his government announced the independent review, placed restrictions on West 4 while the review was occurring, and not just coincidentally, an election campaign. But then again, secretly removed the restrictions in the deal with West 4, signed on October 1st, 2018. I always thought was suspicious because it was the day that the new NAFTA was announced. So you understand why a moratorium is needed. You, the government of the day, simply buckled under pressure or strategically assumed that another way was the way ahead. Now it's your turn, Mr. Premier. And it's not just Jacob and us here asking for a moratorium. Half of the advisory committee on the independent review, essentially the scientific half, broke ranks and called for the moratorium last winter. That's why it should be an easy thing to do, Mr. Premier. You don't need to do it for Jacob, but actually your chance to do that is now too late. It sure would have been nice and a sign of respect to him and his generation if you had to just talk to him, but that, as they say, that's too late. And that was a political choice. And you don't need to do it because we're all out here and pleading you to do it. Mr. Premier, you need to do it simply because it is the right thing to do. The right, scientifically, ethically, and even politically.